Oh, okay, so I'm the moderator. My name is Jim Schwab. My identification is up there. I'm an urban planner, a longtime manager of the APA Hazards Planning Center and still teaching at the University of Iowa, and chair-elect of the APA Hazard Mitigation and Disaster Recovery Planning Division. And I do, before we introduce the speakers, I also want to extend our thanks to Kimberly Miller for some support in terms of monitoring questions and helping out with the development of this webinar, as well as Mike McAnally, who is doing us the invaluable service of monitoring and maintaining the progress of the webinar and making sure that everything is up and running. So, Mike, if you can move to the next slide. So we will start with our two chapter presidents, one of whom is James Rouse. He's AICP. He is with the New York Metro chapter, was president of the New York Metro chapter during Hurricane Sandy back in 2012 and 13. He also works for Bronx Borough president in New York City as the director of development. Kim Mickelson is a lawyer who is also a planner, AICP, and was president of the Texas chapter during when Hurricane Harvey hit a couple of years ago. And she will discuss her experiences in that regard. She is currently working for the city of Houston in its legal department. And with that, we'll move to our speakers. I'll introduce them as well, and then we'll get started with our presentations. So Michael Morella will talk about the experience in dealing with recovery planning from Hurricane Sandy in New York. He is with the New York City Department of City Planning. Some may have known for several years. He is particularly focused on waterfront planning as head of the waterfront planning in New York. There's a great deal of expertise on that. Stephen Costello is the Chief Recovery Officer, essentially the recovery czar for the mayor of the city of Houston. And he will talk about Houston's experience with Hurricane Harvey. And he will be accompanied in that presentation by Marissa Aho, who is AICP. She is actually an AICP commissioner as well, and the brand new Chief Resilience Officer for the city of Houston. Been on the job, I think, 2-3 weeks. So she's getting settled in, but she is previously the Chief Resilience Officer for the city of Los Angeles before moving to Houston. So that's our panel for today, and we will begin with James Rouse talking about his experience in New York. James, you there?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Appreciate it. Again, I'm James Rouse. I was the former chapter president of New York Metro chapter from 2012 through 2016. Again, I'm currently Director of Planning and Development with the Bronx Borough President and AICP Commission Liaison for the Chapter President's Council. Well, I'm going to talk about briefly today, and bear with us. Clicking on to the next slide takes about 7 or 8 seconds to do, so if there's a pause, that's why. My presentation today was going to focus briefly on the New York Metro chapter's response to Superstorm Sandy. On October 29th, 28 days after I took over as chapter president on October 1st, Superstorm Sandy hit New York City full fury. It caught us really off guard, primarily because the year before, Tropical Storm Irene was supposed to hit New York City hard and missed us, and hit Hudson Valley, upstate New York, and Vermont. So a lot of us were unprepared, as we're in the Northeast generally unprepared for these type of storms. Usually our big concern is blizzard related. So the next day, in response to this storm, most of our 1,300 members started calling frantically, looking how to help. Being a new chapter president, being in a region that hadn't really dealt with this type of situation before, we needed to come up with a plan. So the first two things we did was we needed to do is identify the landscape. Like, what are we dealing with here? What is happening? This is not something we've encountered before. How do we go about this? What is our plan of action? And in doing that, we also had to identify who we are, because there's a lot of moving components happening during a disaster response, and what exactly is our role. Next slide. So generally what we followed was a pretty straightforward sequential. Did you click the next slide?
And if everyone could mute their line who is not speaking, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, there's some background noise. Thank you. So what we intuitively based our response on was, previous slide, please, the National Development Recovery Framework, which basically set it up in a kind of a timeline. What are our short-term obstacles? What is our medium-term plan? What is the long-term plan? And so we had to really look and come up with 3 separate action plans of how we wanted to respond. In the short term, what we determined is planners don't really have an immediate role in the response in terms of what we do on a day-to-day basis. A lot of the recovery, could you go back to the succeeding slide? What we focus on is not really, I don't want to say pertinent, but not really at the core of what's needed. Because in the days following a disaster, what's really needed are emergency management services and just overall government coordination. So you're talking uniform services, you're talking emergency management, you're talking disaster relief organizations. And so while as a chapter we had hundreds and hundreds of people of our members looking to volunteer, there really wasn't an outlet or a place for us to point them to. So what we did is that we acted as a referral service for them to volunteer and donate. And that ranged from working with the Red Cross, Robin Hood Foundation, Occupy Sandy, a lot of advocacy groups that were out there doing this kind of work, connecting them with local towns and municipalities who had calls for volunteers. And so we really guided our planners in the first 2 weeks to focus their energies on that if they want to get immediately involved in the response. What we realized is that most of our energy would focus on the medium term and the long term vision. In terms of the medium term, we had a lot of groups and organizations and municipalities reach out to us who equally did not know what to do in a disaster situation. A lot of towns on Long Island had lost power, didn't have backup generators. Within New York City and along the New Jersey coast, there were a lot of similar conditions where there was a lot of development right up to the waterfront. You know, New York City and New Jersey coast is a lot of very dense development. Even if it's not multifamily, it's a lot of homes built very close together. So what we did is we worked with a lot of different groups to help create a vision and rebuild with stakeholders. Most of the work that we did was primarily focused in New York City as issues with just government and culturally in places like Long Island. It was very different, and there were a lot of just obstacles to overcome. So a lot of the work that we focused on was within New York City boundaries, primarily in the Rockaways, South and Central Shore, Mid-Shore of Staten Island, and Coney Island as well. Those were some of the hardest hit areas. But with the Rockaway Peninsula in particular, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And also we offered pro bono planning and education. We tried to bring in experts, thanks to APA National, FEMA, folks like Jim Schwab who have connections to bring in consultants and experts to do a lot of basic education. We worked with groups like the Staten Island chapter of the American Institute of Architects to do a charrette so that they could figure out what to do in what they considered a slow government response to what was happening on the mid and south shores of Staten Island. In terms of long-term, what we identified is how do we keep the conversation going? Part of that was providing testimony to our elected officials. We spoke at the New York State Senate and New York State Assembly, which was crucial in terms of importance because a lot of the response for much of New York State outside of New York City was with the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery, which is a newly created agency by Governor Cuomo. So our advice in terms of the Assembly and Senate, in terms to move legislation forward and to help advise groups like the New York State Department of State, Environmental Conservation and such, was really crucial. And it was our role to assure that planning had a continued voice in the conversation, that it wasn't just about architectural designs and engineering feats, that holistic planning was crucial to what needed to be done. Next slide, please. So what were some of our takeaways from our experience? Again, it was important to identify what your role is in a disaster recovery. As planners, you may want to get involved right away. You may want to do something. And what we found was that the best thing to do was to refer to emergency managers and municipalities who have the expertise in emergency management and disaster recovery, because what we do is to primarily think a little more long-term. You know, identify the landscape, like how bad is the disaster? What are the dynamics that you're dealing with? It's good to take a very holistic approach to stakeholder outreach to get in all opinions, particularly when you're dealing with a large geographic area, a large metropolitan area, and when you're dealing with overlapping jurisdictions and municipalities. Not only did Superstorm Sandy impact the New York metropolitan area, which is primarily 3 states, but the entire northeast seaboard. And also you have entities such as the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which represent 2 separate states. And also it's important to take cultural differences into account. Like what I had mentioned before, one reason why we dealt a lot with New York City was just because some of the towns in Westchester that were affected approach things very different as well, and very differently on Long Island. There's a lot of home rule on Long Island. A lot of towns want to go about it themselves, and so kind of breaking through those barriers was a very different approach. So you have to take a multifaceted approach and really analyze the landscape of who and the type of people you're dealing with, because some people like to, roll up their sleeves and go it alone. Other folks are willing to be more open and collaborative. And some are just looking for just any type of advice and any help. What helps to that is, both literally and figuratively, you have to map things out. Graphics are important to convey your message. It's also important for you to take a step back and see what your landscape is. But you really need to, look at things, short, medium, and long term. Crucial to this is also the external communication. You need to identify strategic partnerships. We worked with other professional organizations, AIA, ASLA. We worked with municipalities on all government levels in the United States. We worked with the Kingdom of the Netherlands. We worked with many not-for-profit organizations, both local and national. And really, you have to come up with a media plan to get the word out. That is important because people are going to be looking to you for leadership. They're going to be looking to you for guidance, and really making the right partnerships on the media level is key. We worked with local TV channel, New York One, in Jersey, New York Star Ledger, a lot of local newspapers, just really getting that word out so we can bring to light that we're available. Next slide.
I did. If I may intercept for just a second, if you're not a speaker, please mute your phone so we don't hear all that background noise. Thank you.
Yeah. So in closing, what we just to show you what happened here, I'm just putting up some links to show you what our work resulted in. So the first link is for the Metro chapter, a report called Getting Back to Business. So this is the work we did in the Rockaways where we focused on trying to get businesses reopened, because repopulating the peninsula and rebuilding the peninsula would be pointless if there weren't goods and services and an economy to foster. The Rockaway Peninsula is pretty isolated in New York City. It's the southwest corner of New York City that's actually not connected on land to the rest of the city. You have to take a bridge or a ferry, and also a Long Island Railroad stop that goes there. So just to give an idea of one of the resulting efforts that we did that was really helpful for a local not-for-profit, the Rockaway Development and Revitalization Corporation, to raise money on the peninsula to do a lot of revitalization. This is a really good document. And finally, a little bit of self-promotion here. I did my capstone thesis on institutional coordination and crisis management after the storm. So there's a lot of good, not only strategies, but a lot of good stories and case studies to give a reflection of how diverse our region was in terms of needing to take a step back and having a more holistic strategy in terms of being able to deal with the storm. So I thank you for the opportunity to present and give a synopsis of what happened from our end at the Metro chapter in Sandy. Later on, Mike Morella from City Planning will give you a more detailed point of view, but I'm happy to answer any questions at the end.
Okay, thank you, James. And we will shift gears now to Kimberly Mickelson, who was serving as the Texas chapter president when Hurricane Harvey hit. And then we'll get to Michael Morella in just a second. So go ahead.
Great. I was going to ask if maybe you could just go back one more slide. I didn't do separate slides when I saw these because I thought James did such a good job of this. I was chapter president during Harvey, as mentioned, here in Texas, and also about the midpoint of Harvey, starting a job at the city of Houston. And you couldn't get anywhere. I couldn't get out of my neighborhood. I couldn't get into the office on Monday, August 28th. So it gave me a lot of time. Fortunately, I had internet and phone, and I could sit there and kind of think, okay, what can we do from an APA perspective? And I spent a lot of time immediately calling other chapters, New York, Louisiana, to say, okay, what next? Like New York Metro, we got a lot of emails and phone calls pretty quickly from other planners. Okay, what are we going to do when this is over? Especially towards the end of that week, Harvey really kind of got over by about Tuesday, Wednesday of that week. And, you know, it's gratifying to see the surge of interest and caring from planners, and it is really hard to figure out what you do immediately in that immediate post-storm time frame. So taking a hint from Steve Villavaso, former chapter president of Louisiana during Katrina, I think we have a strange little fraternity growing here. His main comment was start a committee. So we sent out a email to the membership of Texas APA to just say, hey, we're putting this effort together. What do people want to do short, medium, and long term? Because as James identifies, there are discrete phases in disaster recovery. We ended up with very quickly a pretty large group of people, I'll say 50 or so, who were immediately interested in helping in any or all of those phases. You can't do anything right away. You know, immediate post-storm, people are digging out of houses, getting debris out of streets, and you can't add more people to that mix very easily. even in the extremely short term, we had planners who wanted to go down to communities, go out to communities that had experienced a lot of the damage. And we were somewhat fortunate in the Houston area that some of the outlying cities had, smaller cities had greater damage, but the south of Houston, Rockport and Freeport were among the hardest hit, and then to the east, Port Arthur. So it was a little spread out from our central area here in the big city. Kind of a much different framework to work with. But then people really wanted to get out come in from Central Texas to some of these communities and identify how they could get out there, help move debris, help handle permitting or immediate issues in those first few disasters.
Thank you.
Could you put your phone on mute?
If you're not a speaker, please put your phone on mute. Correct.
Again, we identified a lot of partnerships. One of the first phone calls I got was from the Texas Municipal League, because they were getting phone calls from people who, community leaders in smaller cities, and even out in rural county areas, unincorporated areas, that they didn't know what to do next. There was really not a lot of good manual information out there of how to take inventory, how to start documenting things for FEMA reimbursement, and just really how to manage it. We were able to leverage our Texas Planners for Health project that we did on disaster recovery from another disaster from tornadoes. For some of that was kind of still in progress, so we didn't have the document there, but that I think became a really helpful partnership as well. Locally, we worked with Houston Area Research Council, the local ULI chapter, AIA, the universities, all of the usual suspects, Harris County Flood Control, other county officials from the surrounding counties, to come together to try and marshal resources and identify what opportunities there were to get information out, who had already done what, so we didn't duplicate efforts. And I think that really helps as well. Everybody wants to do something, and everybody is working on something. So knowing what the other side is doing is really important. I reached out to APA National to see about getting community planning assistance teams, not necessarily lined up immediately, because that's really more of a medium or long range planning solution, but to let them know that we wanted to start targeting some of the, we call them CPAT teams, or CPAT efforts for the communities that were hit around the Houston area. Houston, maybe like New York City, got a lot of the love because this is where FEMA ended up, and this is where a lot of the dollars and initial efforts for help and so forth came in. We wanted, as planners, to focus on some more of the outlying communities that were hit and our smaller cities and towns that maybe they have a planner and maybe they don't. And if they have a planner, that's the person that they have who really needs support. One big effort of the Harvey Recovery Committee from the Texas chapter is culminating in this webinar, and Kimberly Miller, who's on the line and shepherding questions, took on the lion's share of chairing this committee and really getting this proposal out to start the information and recovery efforts to our membership, and providing those kind of resources that our members immediately needed, putting them in touch with the right people. I would say a couple of lessons from a takeaway. I think there really was an interest in, and what I wish we could figure out how to do better in the very short term is that immediate planner on loan kind of program, and how do you identify and link up those people from, say, Central Texas who want to come down and help in Rockport or help in Dickinson or help in Port Arthur. And that's just tough to link up. We didn't quite get our hands around that, and it's something we sadly will probably know. We know we will be able to plan for that eventuality. It's tough when housing is down and you can't house your volunteers. So that, I think, is one takeaway for how to improve it for the next time, to figure out those short-term immediate assistance needs and how we might get those financed. This is, to me, a little bit of the kind of mid-range or, longer short-term, end of the short term, maybe into the mid-range planning, where we do now have a CPAT team in Rockport. We've had, I know ULI and some APA members have gone out to Port Arthur. So we are starting to get out into those communities. We are monitoring legislation. The Texas legislature is currently meeting, so part of the Harvey recovery team is also doing what James indicated, preparing summaries of the bills for flood, climate control, resiliency efforts, notification on property records and so forth for floodplain information. So all of those are still ongoing and still a little new for us, but overall the response from planners around the country and certainly within the state has been phenomenal, and just really rewarding to work through this process and getting to rely on the APA family. Like James, I'll be here, and I'm happy to answer questions specifically about Texas, but I want to hear from the rest of them now.
Okay, very good. And I do want to mention very quickly before we go to Michael Morella, as you listen to the presentations, there is a chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will ask you to type your questions in, and we will have a chance to ask those questions of the speakers when we're done. And with that note, Michael Morella is now available to talk about coastal climate resiliency in New York City.
Great. Thank you, Jim, and thanks to everyone who's on the call. And special thanks to both the Texas chapter of APA and National APA for organizing this call. I have to say, I was in this title during Hurricane Sandy, and after Hurricane Sandy, the many meetings and calls like this that the APA set up were particularly helpful in help formulating our thoughts for how to respond to Hurricane Sandy. So why don't we go to the next slide and talk a little bit about the risk that we face in New York City, and starting with what happened during Hurricane Sandy. As I said, I was in my title during Hurricane Sandy and witnessed this firsthand. And as the director of waterfront planning, I have to say it was a heart-wrenching experience to see the areas of the city that I love hit so very hard. There were 43 deaths, roughly 51 square miles of flooding, close to 90,000 buildings, nearly 450,000 residents in the inundation area. A couple of things to note was that 98% of the buildings that were destroyed were built prior to 1983. That was the year that the city adopted the building code standards to match the National Flood Insurance Program at that time. 88% of the buildings that were destroyed were lower density, 1- and 2-family homes. And over 50% of the buildings that were in the inundation area were outside of what was then current FEMA flood zone. And so that's also another really important statistic about how we very much underestimated our risk, as James alluded to earlier, and really did catch us off guard. Next slide, please. In New York City, we have 520 miles of waterfront. It's we have the largest waterfront of any municipality in the United States, and it's incredibly diverse as well. That ranges from the dense urban waterfront that you may think of at the foot of Manhattan to the natural landscape in Alley Pond Creek in Queens, or the bungalows built out over the water in the Rockaways to the mixed-use development in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. All of these face incredibly different risks and are a reflection of the city as a whole, but mean that we have to have strategies that deal with all of these. So next slide, please. After Hurricane Sandy, FEMA established preliminary flood insurance rate maps, and those maps were larger than what was done previously. And in the 1% annual chance floodplain as mapped by FEMA today, there are roughly 70,000 buildings and approximately 400,000 residents. To put that into perspective, that's roughly the population of a mid-sized American city like Minneapolis, and I imagine many mid-sized cities in Texas as well. But when we have that population and that number of buildings already in our floodplain, it's not a question of how do we prevent development in the floodplain. That was a decision that was made many generations ago, obviously. And so it really is a question of what do we do with that existing condition. Next slide, please. Part of that existing condition is the diversity of land uses, as I mentioned earlier. The vast majority of buildings in our floodplain in New York City are detached homes, many of them semi-detached or two-family homes. But when you look at the majority of the housing units, they're found within larger apartment buildings. And so looking at just the buildings alone, our distribution of buildings might be somewhat similar to many areas of elsewhere in the floodplain around the country. But when you dig a little deeper and look at the types of buildings that we had and the number of units in those buildings is where you really begin to see that New York has this unusually high risk associated with large multifamily buildings in the flood zone. Next slide, please. In addition to the risk that we face today, there's also the future risk that we face from large surge events like Hurricane Sandy. And by the 2050s, the floodplain will grow considerably due to sea level rise based on the projections of the New York City Panel on Climate Change. And that's a panel convened at the behest of the mayor, but serving independently and acting independently to come up with climate projections for New York City and the metropolitan area. And those projections show that by the 2050s, we could see an additional roughly 2.5 to 3 feet of sea level rise around New York City, and with that would increase the geography of the floodplain. With that increased geography would mean increases to roughly 120,000 buildings and nearly 800,000 residents, nearly doubling the number of residents in today's floodplain. And again, this is the challenges that we face going forward. Next slide, please. In addition to the infrequent events like Hurricane Sandy, we are also likely going to be facing flooding on a regular basis at in some of the neighborhoods that are most low-lying. On the map on the right, you'll see what appears in pink and purple, and for the vast majority of those areas, especially those that appear in the darker purple, those are areas that are uninhabited, that are the salt marshes around Jamaica Bay and along the west shore of Staten Island. However, some of the other areas where we could be seeing flooding by mid to later half of this century are inhabited areas, and this is where a different type of risk we face. Next slide, please. And so we have been looking at all of these various aspects of risk, of the risk profile of the city as a whole, and the way we have done that is really twofold. We have conducted 10 neighborhood planning studies across all 5 boroughs. Those are what we refer to as our resilient neighborhood studies. And they included low-density 1- and 2-family districts in Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island to high-density mixed-use districts in Manhattan. In addition to that, those neighborhood studies, we've conducted 4 topic area studies. One is about retrofitting buildings for flood risk, obviously quite relevant when we have roughly 70,000 buildings in today's flood zone. A study of resilient art spaces, recognizing that one of our arts districts is located within the floodplain in the west side of Manhattan. A study of resilient retail, similar, picking up on some of the themes that James mentioned earlier in the Rockaways. And a report on resilient industry as well. Next slide, please. That has led us to an approach for how we think about zoning and land use in the floodplain. And in New York City, we really see it as a spectrum. For the most part, because we have roughly 70,000 existing buildings in the floodplain, we want to make certain that the buildings that are there and the densities that are allowed under zoning are supported by our land use and zoning actions, and that we want to adjust zoning to allow all buildings to meet resiliency standards by providing the necessary flexibility and removing zoning obstacles. That's really the vast majority of our approach for addressing the flood risk associated with an event like Hurricane Sandy. In other areas of the city where we can increase density in the flood zone, that in fact may be appropriate as well, recognizing that when we are building anew, we are oftentimes building far more resiliently than what was done in the past. And this proved incredibly incredibly relevant during Hurricane Sandy, in that buildings that were built to contemporary codes at that time fared far better than those that were built before codes, and including that in many instances, I should say, that buildings that were built to contemporary codes had very, very minor damage. A few broken windows, a little bit of water coming into the lobbies of buildings, but by and large, those buildings were able to get back online, and residents were able to occupy those buildings in quick order compared to those buildings that were built prior to code standards. Buildings oftentimes had mechanical systems flooded, or at the worst, were entirely knocked off their foundations. And so when there's that type of distinction, the recognition that codes matter is an important part of it. However, on the far left of the spectrum, in some areas, we see a need to limit future density as to decrease the exposure to damage and disruption. And these are those areas that are likely to face daily tidal inundation with sea level rise. Next slide, please. And that leads us to one of our approaches in zoning, and that the establishment of the Special Coastal Risk District. That's a zoning overlay district that we established for a few neighborhoods that serve as means of significantly reducing the potential for new development. It's not removing all development rights, obviously, but it's reducing the potential for new development so as to limit the exposure going forward. And this is a first step. This is not the last step that's going to be necessary in these neighborhoods, but this is a first step as a way of tapping the brakes and saying we need to figure out what the future can hold for this neighborhood, given all of the tools at the disposal of the city. And so we now have passed 3 separate rezonings in specific neighborhoods that are facing this extreme risk. Next slide, please. Looking to also support plan densities is a citywide zoning text amendment that we're working on right now that largely moves forward with the making permanent some changes that we made immediately after Hurricane Sandy. And these are to encourage resiliency throughout the city's current and future floodplains, supporting long-term resilient design of all building types by offering flexibility within our zoning framework, allowing for adaptation over time through partial resiliency strategies, recognizing that with so many existing buildings, they're not necessarily going to be torn down entirely and built anew, and that buildings should be able to incorporate resiliency improvements, even if they are not meeting the entirety of new construction standards. And then goal number 4 is about facilitating future recovery by removing regulatory obstacles, another important part of that as well. Next slide, please. And that leads us to where we see the opportunities to increase densities in and adjacent to the floodplain. And that includes the rezoning in Far Rockaway, Queens, an area that James mentioned, that is just on the edge of the flood zone, but for where there is already significant density in the neighborhood, as well as significant infrastructure investments there. It's served by one of New York City's subway lines. It has obviously all of the infrastructure investments that are necessary for a neighborhood of the city, and so there was the opportunity to increase development, and those new buildings would be built to higher standards. And so this was one approach that we appropriate. Next slide, please. One of the other elements of our work is obviously going beyond zoning, and an important component of that was public information. And using the tools and knowledge that we have at the Department of City Planning and sharing them broadly with New Yorkers. That included putting together an online web mapping tool, the Flood Hazard Mapper, that allows the public to zoom in on a neighborhood and not only see the current FEMA flood maps, but also the FEMA flood maps of the future as projected by the New York City Panel on Climate Change, and what could be the daily tidal inundation areas based on those same projections. We have also put together a number of info briefs on flood insurance, flood risk in New York City, as well as flood resilient construction, and these two are available on our website. And I certainly think that some of this information, though oftentimes based on slightly higher densities than you may find in many of the communities in Texas, probably have some very relevant information as well. Next slide, please. In addition to the public information, also have obviously been investing a lot in coastal protection. The map on this slide shows the full build-out of coastal protection plan that was proposed shortly after Hurricane Sandy. This plan as a whole is obviously an incredibly ambitious measure to protect and to reduce risk over the 520 miles of the city's waterfront. The first phase of this coastal protection plan is approximately $20 billion, which is underway right now and being done in partnership with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in many instances, as well as several projects that the city is undertaking right now, primarily with funding that was allocated by Congress after Hurricane Sandy. Next slide, please. In addition to the coastal protection, the city has also been making certain that we are upgrading and building our infrastructure to take into climate risks going forward. And that's where the city's climate resiliency design guidelines come into place. These were the most recent version 3.0 of this document was released just last week. And the intent is that resilient design become part of the project planning process for city agencies and designers, making certain that whether it be our wastewater treatment plants and our sewer lines, water systems, to our transportation infrastructure, all be designed with the future risks that we face in mind. One of the other projects in New York City to reduce risk was the state buyout program that was in Staten Island. There were a total of 3 different neighborhoods that had buyouts. This is an image from the Oakwood Beach neighborhood. Sorry, could we go to the next slide? I apologize. This image that's going to come up in just one second is of the Oakwood Beach neighborhood on Staten Island, where the state was able to acquire the vast majority of residents, leaving a large and mostly contiguous open space. However, there were still a few holdouts, folks who opted not to sell to the state. And what this means is that there are areas that look like this now, where you have large open space on roads that have to continue to be maintained going forward. Obviously, buyouts are an important tool, but when they don't have 100% participation, the onus is then put on the local municipality to continue to provide services and to maintain the roads, et cetera, for the remaining residents. That said, and next slide, please. This is kind of sort of a whirlwind tour of our post-Sandy activities and planning over the past 6.5 years, hoping to paint what appears to be a comprehensive picture of how we've been to address these risks going forward, but one that I think really requires even more than 6.5 years and a much longer timeline, because these are challenges that are not just about rebuilding after a storm, but about addressing the resiliency long term. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That's not only a whirlwind tour, but quite a remarkable one. And hopefully that will lead well into the next presentation from Stephen Costello, the Chief Recovery Officer for the City of Houston. And we need to move to that slide.
Yes, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone.
So,
the City of Houston is somewhat different than the City of New York in terms of we're still in the recovery phase, is what we call it, leading into what we call the resiliency phase. So if you go to the next slide, I make a number of public presentations about Hurricane Harvey and what was so unique about it to the state of Texas. And this graphic here, this shows the extent of rainfall that occurred across the entire state of Texas. And by color code, the white ring demarks the 100-year flood event. So you literally could travel 2 hours by highway in every direction from downtown Houston, and you would experience a 100-year or more rainfall event. In Harvey, we had the 24-hour rainfall event, maximum 24-hour rainfall event was 36 inches. The 5-day total was a little over 52 inches of rainfall. Now, when I explain this to my audiences, I remind them that what's so unique about Harvey is that it was a rainfall event, and that we are actually subject to 3 modes of flooding and threats. One is hurricane surge, because if you look where it says Texas City, that water body just north of Texas City is Galveston Bay, leads into the Houston Ship Channel. So hurricane surge is a unique challenge in that part of the city area. Then we're also subject to riverine flooding. You'll see an exhibit later on in the presentation where we actually have rivers or bayous, we call them, that flow through the city. And once they exceed their capacity, they flood our neighborhoods. And then the third one, which is more of a unique one, which is what we call urban flooding. We have a city that has challenges in terms of our infrastructure, particularly our stormwater infrastructure. And I'll talk a little bit more as we go on. So if you go to the next slide is really a sort of a highlight of who was impacted and how. And what's really sort of troubling was when you compare the number of homes damaged across the state and the number of homes that were approved for applications from FEMA, you get the realization of how many people were not in a regulatory floodplain or didn't have flood insurance. And that's really one of the challenges of the flood insurance program and the flood maps, is because people perceive that they're not in any risk when they're not located in a regulatory floodplain. And that is really a problem for every community, not just Houston, not just New York City, but everywhere throughout the country. So we have to remind them that the maps are not risk maps. They're flood insurance maps that are really used by agencies for flood insurance purposes. The other thing that I thought was unique, during Harvey, during the response phase, while Harvey was occurring and a few days afterwards, we had a number of challenges in terms of coordinating services, whether it's with public service response or whether it's shelters, helping people, providing supplies to shelters. Normally that's programmed through the emergency ops, usually it's the Office of Emergency Management. But you find that most of those offices are staffed with not planners, they're staffed with usually public safety people. And, you know, if I was, I know I'm talking to a planning audience, one of the things that a planner can do is to sit down with a municipality and help coordinate and plan a better response. Before and after, to look at how a city is responding to a particular event. Because we had some significant challenges. We reside in Harris County, and so this flooded the entire county, not just the city of Houston. And so when people were calling for help, they were inadvertently calling the wrong agencies and then going to the wrong shelters that were providing services. So people were constantly in mobile routes. The other challenge on the planning side, which I didn't experience the need for until the Monday post the event, we had a water plant that was being inundated by floodwaters, and it was a primary surface water treatment plant for our primary water system. And we needed to make sure that the plant didn't go down because we didn't want to say to people, boil water. And so we wanted to purchase some what we call tiger dams, which are inflatable dams to put around the plant to prevent it from flooding. And we couldn't get the dam supplier to the location because the city was nearly in an island, that all of our major highways are flooded. So there really needs to be someone sitting down and trying to discuss a more of a mobility plan for access during an extreme event. And I don't think anyone has really paid much attention to that. So those are some of the challenges that we have. But if you go to the next slide, what happened after Harvey was sort of interesting. And I'm going to give you a perspective from someone who's been in the stormwater business for many years, coming from private practice. And one of the issues as engineers that we were advocating for many, many years is stormwater infrastructure investment. And what the responses we kept getting from the political leadership was, well, you're just self-serving because you guys want to design all of the improvements. And, well, that's true. The engineers would design the improvements, but you don't want a dentist designing roads and you don't want an engineer drilling on teeth, is the way we were trying to explain it to them. The other thing, which is really a public phenomenon, is when the storms that we had experienced over the last 30 years were not very frequent. So they would be 5 to 8 to 10 years apart. And they weren't as global an impact as Harvey was to the region. And so what would happen was we would get this isolated 500-year rainfall event that would impact a small part of the city, and the rest of the city was just going about their daily routine. And then you go a couple of years after that event, those people who were impacted by flooding have rebuilt and have gone back to their daily lives. So everyone forgets. But what happened, what was unique was 2015, we had 2 of those isolated 500-year rainfall events, one in Memorial Day and one in October. We call it the Halloween Day flood. And then in 2016, we had another isolated 500-year rainfall event in a different part of the city in 2016 called Tax Day flood. And then we had Hurricane Harvey. The difference with Hurricane Harvey was that it flooded across the entire county and the city. And so now what we're hearing is, where have you been all these years in stormwater infrastructure? Why haven't you provided protection to us? And we're ready to have an investment in infrastructure. And so if there's anything associated with a silver lining with an event like Harvey, is the fact that it's brought about awareness to flood risk, flood protection, and flood investment. And so that's what's really kind of unique about what's going on. And so during recovery, some of the challenges that we were having is while we're waiting for federal dollars, the community is asking at large, well, what can you do while you wait for the federal dollars to come in to help us? And so what you see here on this slide is some of the activities that the city was doing pre-Harvey and then post-Harvey. So on the left side, we were experiencing ongoing what we call redevelopment within the city. So there were older homes that were being torn down, new homes being built. Some of them were actually being denser, meaning a house would be replaced with 2 or 3 townhouses. And so there was a lot of strain on redevelopment. And so we were talking pre-Harvey about some of the challenges that we were going to address, and then Harvey occurred. And so it was interesting, post-Harvey, we went back to address those redevelopment issues, and the one that I wanted to highlight the most is detention. And so what we were doing pre-Harvey was we were grandfathering existing development. So what does that mean? So you would have a 10-acre site that was a commercial development, and a new developer comes in, scrapes it all clean, and puts a new development on it, and we would say, okay, it was previously fully developed, you don't have to mitigate for your stormwater. And so that was the grandfathering clause. Well, post-Harvey, we got the political will to make the change that if you scrape that site entirely clean and make it a greenfield and redevelop it, then it's considered greenfield. We don't give you the credit for existing development. That was a game changer for the city of Houston, and it's really changed a lot because we kept getting a lot of pressure from the outlying subdivisions within the city. Post-Harvey, one of the challenges that we had was, again, this 100-year, 500-year. There was a lot of issues and a lot of discussion about the fact that we were allowing development to occur in the floodplain. Now, obviously, since we're participants in the National Flood Insurance Program, we have floodplain regulations on what you do and what you can't do in the floodplain. But the mayor decided that it was important to do something different. And so what he did was he charged Public Works with a thought of what can we do different for existing development and new development, associated one with redevelopment and one with new development, in terms of providing added protection. And here's the reason why. Right after Harvey, we got a lot of pressure from the public saying, well, the city has been perceived as a developer-friendly city with no zoning. And yet you have all of these areas that are in the floodplain that are subject to flooding. The problem is that we had to remind them that we didn't officially adopt the National Flood Insurance maps until 1981. And the minute the maps were adopted, 70% of the floodplain was already developed. So, they kept saying to us, you need to clear out the floodplain, keep it all greenfield. Well, you can't do that logically. And then so we were managing according to those set of maps. And so obviously development was occurring along those fringes of those floodplains. And then what happens is, what people don't realize is those flood insurance rate maps are living maps. As we get more technical data, we end up changing those maps. So over the 40 years of my career in flood insurance and flood mapping, our local maps have changed 3 times. And in each time it's changed, it's gotten wider. And so in areas where they were developing outside the floodplain, a new set of maps come out, they're now in the floodplain. And it continued on. And so the last set of mapping that we did was in response to Tropical Storm Allison in 2001. And it took us 7 years to redo all of the mapping throughout the city and the county. And I'm going to give you a worst-case scenario. There was an apartment complex that was built right along the bayou. Pre the 1981 maps, it wasn't in any floodplain. The 1981 maps come out, it's now in the regulatory floodplain. The next set of maps, it's now deeper in the floodplain. The third set of maps, it's now in the floodway. The fourth set of maps, it's totally in the floodway. And so through no fault of that particular development or the regulatory agency that allowed them to build, they are now deep in the floodplain. And so there are a number of challenges that we have in dealing with regulatory floodplains. And so what we decided to do post-Harvey is to say, okay, we're going to anticipate another change in the flood maps. So we are now going to tell everybody that we're no longer going to build to the minimum NFIP standards, which is 100-year flood plus 1 foot, that we're going to ask them to build higher. So if you go to the next slide will give you a little bit of an indication of why we did this. So the next slide is actually the changes that we made. And the reason why we were making them is that we have advanced information from NOAA that they were going to publish new rainfall data for the city of Houston and Harris County. And that's this particular map we're looking at. And in the chart, you'll see that the flood elevations, or excuse me, the rainfall, the rainfall isolated out in regions. And so as you go from the far northwest side to the southeast side, the rainfall went from, on the original 100-year 24-hour storm of 12 inches, it will now be 16 inches of rainfall. And if you go all the way over to Region 3, it was going from 13 inches of rain to 18 inches of rain. And so we were anticipating a significant change in all of our flood mapping. And so the mayor decided he wanted to change all of the elevations to build to a much higher elevation. If you go to the next slide, this is what's important on a public message. Because as we're going through and meeting the public, this is the message the mayor was telling everybody, that we need to build for the future rather than build back to failure. And he's committed to that. And you have to understand there's a lot of pressure from the development community and the business leaders here about significantly responding to Harvey and making changes. And yet the citizens of the city want change. So we're working on a balance. But the other message that we have here is the second sentence, which is what we get when we're in public speaking. Am I safer today than I was before Harvey? And the answer is no. And the reason why is that we're still in the recovery phase. So if you go to the next slide, this is the slide that I visit with the community now to describe what we're doing in Harvey in terms of recovery. And what this is those are the 4 sources of money from 2 specific agencies that are helping us recover. And I walk them through each one of these pockets of money. And so the funds that we have now are in the public assistance column, and the funds that we have in the housing, the far right column, in terms of getting recovery. The funds that we hope to get will be the mitigation funds from HUD to invest in infrastructure to protect the housing investment we're doing now on the recovery side. And the same thing over on the far left, which is the hazard mitigation grant funds that we're pursuing, will be utilizing to protect the investments on the public recovery side. But I remind everybody that this is not a 1 or 2 year process. This is really more of a 5 to 10 and even longer process. But we have to be diligent in going through that process. And it's a little frustrating dealing with the federal levels of government. And really what I've learned coming from private practices is that you have to be persistent. And you have to keep bugging people, and you have to find where the pain points are and keep moving them forward. So those are some of the challenges. The other issue it's really unique to the city of Houston is the conversation over the mapping and whether or not the maps truly reflect flood risk. And so if you think about it from an economic development opportunity, a city or a municipality does not want to show their entire municipality in a floodplain. That makes sense. But you do want to be able to show maps that indicate levels of risk. And so what we're going to be doing over the next 3 years with our local partners is to develop a series of risk maps for the sole purpose of informing the public of what level of risk you're at. And what do I mean by that? When Atlas 14 rainfall data comes out, it's going to change not only the rainfall data we use to design our large mitigation projects, but it'll have the rainfall data we're going to use to build our urban infrastructure. And so we'll be able to show them what level of risk they're going to be at. And I think that's an important message for planners, particularly here in this region, is, okay, if you're anticipating a change in mapping, how do you sort of direct development? Because we don't have zoning. But what we do have is we have a development ordinance called Chapter 42 where, to be honest with you, there are a lot of zoning type issues embedded in that criteria. But literally we could have a 10-story building right next to a 1-story house. That doesn't happen often, but it happens occasionally. So there are unique planning challenges here in the city of Houston. So I'm really excited about that. I think it's interesting because I'm going to turn it over to Marissa Aho because it's really exciting that the next phase, as I'm focusing on recovery, she's going to be focusing on resiliency, and it'll blend together, and I'm really excited about this. I'm going to turn over the rest of the presentation to Marissa.
Thank you, Steve. Hi, everyone. So as Jim mentioned, this is still my first month in Houston. I arrived about a month ago to take on the Chief Resilience Officer role in Houston, a role that I had in Los Angeles for nearly 4 years. And I could not be more thrilled to be in Houston and working for Mayor Turner and with Steve and Kim and all of the people in Houston who are so serious about the resilience work that's being done. About 7 months ago or so, right around the 1-year anniversary of Hurricane Harvey, next slide, please, Houston was announced as the 101st city to join the 100 resilient cities. And it's very exciting because being City 101 means that Houston gets to set the model for cities that are sort of beyond the 100 cities that were originally participating in this program. Houston's participation is due to a $1.8 or so million grant from the Shell Corporation that has allowed me to be here and continue to build upon all of the great work that's been done post-Harvey and even before on resilience and on mitigation, and expand it. Next slide, please. So, really quickly on the network, New York City is, of course, a member of the 100 Resilient Cities, as are Dallas and El Paso in Texas. There have been 51 resilient strategies released globally to date, and the Los Angeles strategy was released about a year ago. So part of the strategy process is, of course, the planning process. You know, I'm a planner. And so the city started out a few months after the announcement was made in getting some information together to have the first community workshop. And so in the pre-workshop survey, you can see that there's an inherent tie to the Harvey recovery in a lot of the words that people were associating with the resilience of the city. There's also nods to equity in the form of the Mayor's Complete Communities program, engagement, innovation, climate, and so on. Next slide, please. And so in November of 2018, the first agenda setting workshop was held with a number of, you can see them all, members of the Houston community, internal and external folks. I see at least one Chief Resilience Officer from another city in that photo as well. Next slide, please. And part of that process was to identify what was happening, what the priorities were, and then the top shocks and stresses. And so the approach to resilience here is looking at all of the potential disruptions in the form of shocks, as well as the stresses that occur on a daily basis, and then looking at the intersection between the two in order to, I like to say, solve for more than one thing at a time. And so the top shocks that were identified are, of course, rainfall flooding, hurricanes, infrastructure failure, and hazardous material accidents, many of which relate to or can be tied to Harvey in some way. And then the top stresses included lack of affordable housing, poverty, inequity, education quality and access, and urban sprawl. And so quickly you can see how all of these things are related. And so in addition to, next slide please, the initial workshop, there was a specific effort to start discussing, or to continue to discussing, sort of this living with water concept. And so there were a number of local, regional, and international experts. You can see Steve's part of this group as well, who spent 2 days starting to develop some initial thoughts on how Houston could, move forward with living with, and in fact, there used to be a drought here, so without water. And so, next slide, please. Some of the key findings, and this is all very initial, clearly, but were broken down into different scales, including regional key messages. One of those suggestions was to develop a region-wide agency checklist for project coordination. District scale, so one of those key messages included getting quick wins to build trust. Planners know about that. One of the Bayou scale key messages was around stronger cross-jurisdictional communication, planning, and data collection. And then one of the typology sort of scale key messages was around the focus of multiple benefits for all policies and land uses. And there are a whole host of other ones there. Next slide, please. So there's been a lot of work to date. There's a group of consultants through the 100 Resiliency Week process who have been working to provide the city, and now me in this role, with a lot of background information related to many of the water resilience efforts that are happening in Houston, key findings from those 2 initial workshops that occurred in November of 2018. And then finally, a summary of a lot of the other existing efforts, both related to water resilience and all other types of resilience, to start to paint the picture of all of the existing actions that are happening within the city that are leading to a greater level of resilience, both internal to the city as well as all of the academic and foundation partners, corporate partners. The word resilience is very popular in Houston compared to my previous experience in Los Angeles. Next slide, please. So this timeline gives you a sense of where we are and where we're headed, and is the resilient strategy process for Houston. That pre-strategy space was in the fall with the workshops. We're in the process of phase 1, which is really initiating the strategy development and figuring out the framework that's going to work best for Houston through the strategy development process. And then in a matter of weeks, we'll launch that phase 2 and hopefully really expedite getting a resilient strategy out for Houston in a very short amount of time, because as I think has been very aware here, as well as in other cities, that the planning part of this process is very important, and it sets the tone and the goals and the policies or actions, but that the faster that this planning process can turn into implementation and be tied to implementation tools and actions, the better. That's pretty much it there. So one last slide from me, which is a little bit of a sense of where we're headed as well. one successful way of framing resilience that we have found is by a way to de-silo the resilience conversations is to frame resilience in terms of scales. And so I've borrowed this graphic from the Resilient Los Angeles strategy, and how we looked at resilience in LA and how we're going to start looking at resilience in Houston is around these scales. And so it's about, how to increase individual resilience, how to recognize that neighborhoods have different shocks and stresses that they are prioritizing, and so how to uniquely craft resilience measures for different neighborhood needs. And then looking at the city scale and how the city can increase its own resilience in terms of solving for more than one thing given limited resources, and how to include things like smart city technology into increasing resilience. And then finally, recognizing that these shocks and stresses don't know city boundaries, and so how can these strategies include partnerships with other regional entities, state entities, federal entities, and various sectors that all have a role in increasing and building resilience as a value and as a daily practice in everything that we do, and in recognition that if one of these scales isn't functioning in a resilient way, then there's the opportunity for them all to not function so well. So there are so many resilience opportunities in Houston to move forward and to build on all of the great work that's already been done. And so I would just close with a hint to stay tuned to what we do next. And thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Marissa, Steve, and Mike. Do we have questions from the audience?
Miller got his report out.
Do you want Sam?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. If not, I'm going to go ahead and ask a couple questions of my own to the panelists. Or do you have a report, Mike? Some questions?
I am looking to see if we have any questions.
Okay. Well, let me ask one in the meantime. Take a look, and I'm going to ask one in the meantime very quickly just to keep things moving. Both Steve and Michael brought up issues that seem to point to some problems with the scope of development related to the floodplain, whether we actually have, I think, a full understanding of the level of flood risk in our cities, and particularly in Houston and New York. There seem to be issues with a lot of development outside the mapped floodplains that was nonetheless affected by flooding, which may raise questions about whether the 100-year floodplain or the floodplain as we understand it is sufficient. So my question is, do you think that the floodplain as we have it now under the National Flood Insurance Program is adequately defined for the needs of resilient cities in your two cases?
Well, I'll start. This is Steve from Houston. One of the issues is the way we label the floodplain. For years, we called it the 100-year flood. And everyone would say, well, I'm not going to get flooded. It's going to be 100 years from now. People don't realize that it's more of a statistical assessment. You can get flooded any day of the week. And it's interesting, as we're going through our recovery process here in Houston, the mayor makes a point of telling everybody in all our public meetings, even if we had everything built, we wouldn't be able to guarantee you wouldn't flood anyway. There's always the risk of flooding. And that's why we're We're advocating for building higher, and we're advocating for people to become knowledgeable of the flood risk. So when I'm also out publicly speaking with my sister agency, which is Harris County Flood Control District, who takes care of the regional flooding, the director and I, the first thing we do is we ask the audience, how many people know where they live? Not your address, but in what watershed? And you'd be surprised, less than 20% of people raise their hand. And then the second question we ask them is, how many of y'all have flood insurance? And it's less than 40% have flood insurance. And so we remind them to get a better understanding of where they live and to remind them that flood insurance is probably the cheapest insurance you can buy in case you need it for recovery.
So this is Michael. I just very much echo what Steve said, that the National Flood Insurance Program is based on the statistically calculated 1% annual chance storm event. But why is that necessarily the right metric? I think that very much has to be asked, and I think we have seen time and time again that what FEMA determines as the 1% chance storm event can be exceeded quite easily. And so certainly a higher or better standard is certainly worth exploring at the municipal level.
Yeah, I think the other thing that we need to be mindful of, there was probably years ago in the 70s, there was probably a risk assessment of which storm would they manage by, whether it was a 500-year storm, a 1,000-year storm, or 50-year storm, and I think they chose the 100. If we start going to a higher type of an event, less frequent higher type of an event, you'll probably start to see more of the government pushing insurance down to the private insurance agencies rather than being federally subsidized. Right now, that's happening just slightly, where you're seeing private insurance companies offering insurance to people who are outside the floodplain. It's like taking the cream of the crop, very similar to ACA, where the healthy people are being insured privately, and it leaves the federal government to insure the people that are high risk medically. And you might see that it's starting to happen now in the flood insurance program. But if we went to a much higher risk, meaning if we mapped it out to a 1,000-year flood event and used that mapping, you're going to find that there's going to be more push for the federal government to get out of the flood insurance program entirely, and then charging people to market risk. And that could be very, very expensive to people.
Okay. Mike, anything ready?
Yes. The first question is a comment from Texas that it made the statement there was lack of information, material, or manuals available on what to do, how to document damages, etc. The question comment is that FEMA and the state of Texas provide a wealth of trained information, disaster response, and recovery. Do we mean that we're not aware of those resources, or is it a question of how to access? How can they be accessed?
Well, I think that issue might be relative to recovery. I think it is. If it's associated with someone who's been flooded, there are a number of ways to receive resources from FEMA. If you don't have flood insurance, is what they call individual assistance, and FEMA will give, I think, up to $30,000 for individual assistance without any bills or anything. But I think there is a formal process of justifying the expense that FEMA has to make that evaluation. We do have, for people who don't have flood insurance, who are in what we call the low to moderate income, we have HUD money that's available for recovery. And based upon your income level, you can get up to $80,000 in recovery to assist you in rebuilding your house. Also, it doesn't necessarily require that you have all your receipts. If you've already done the recovery and you want to get reimbursed from HUD, we have inspectors that will go out and they will literally assess the improvements based on a industry standard norm, and then they would submit that application to HUD to get reimbursement on behalf of the homeowner. So there are other options. It just depends on if you're talking about what guidelines you use to get into the program versus what guidelines you follow in terms of recovery.
And this is Kim Mickelson. I think I made a comment that was a little bit similar to that, and I think the question we got, or that I got specifically from Texas Municipal League, was that many small communities, staff and elected officials, you know, in the immediate aftermath of standing there in the water with no power, no way to get online, to access information, et cetera, that they didn't know where to look immediately. And I know TML said they had many calls from folks who just needed to know what step 1 was and then what step 2 was. And you know, that's one of the gaps that we've tried to fill with our with the disaster recovery guide that we put out through the APA grant for Plan for Health, because we literally had that same reaction in that situation. It was a tornado, but the county judge went out with the emergency operations manager, or the may have been the AgriLife coordinator there, and looked around at the tornado damage and said, well, who's in charge here? And the guy looked at him and said, well, you are, Judge. And yeah, so what do you do next? So it's that kind of information. It's not that FEMA or other agencies don't have a lot. It's how do you get your hands on it immediately and know what to do.
Okay. We're getting close to the closing time. Do you have maybe one more question?
Jim, yes, for Michael Morelli from New York City, the question is, does the impact of the flood insurance program and community rating system impact your current future development planning? What if, with the Flood Insurance Act currently slated to expire on May 30th, what would be the impact of failure of Congress to reenact the Flood Insurance Act?
Well, that's a great question, though I think we're going to need another hour and a half to answer it. I would say very quickly, if the National Flood Insurance Program were to either go away or were to be brought to actuarial-based rates immediately, that would be a disaster not only for New York City, but for all municipalities in the flood zone, and that the real estate market would have to absorb the new cost of actuarial-based insurance rates immediately. I think the great likelihood would be that folks would seek to go without insurance or pay significantly more for insurance. While that may be the ultimate long-term goal, if that were to be done as an immediate step by the failure of Congress, I think that would be greatly problematic, not only for New York City, but for everywhere in the nationwide flood zone.
I'll add a quick plug that if you're not a member of the Planners Advocacy Network, you should join, because this is one thing that we are monitoring through that network and getting people to contribute comments on that. So stay tuned to that on the APA website too.
Yes, I would agree. That's actually one of the legislative priorities for APA at the moment. So we have hit the limit at 4:31 here, so I think we are going to have to close this off. I would like to mention to people that we have a second webinar on April 26th, scheduled for the same time. Notice will come out from the Texas and I suppose the AP New York Metro chapters as well. About that one, it will actually focus more on New Jersey and some of the outlying coastal communities in Texas. And further down the road, with a date not yet set, would be an in-person seminar for most of the day down in Corpus Christi, but those details are still being worked out. And with that, we thank everyone for participating, and stay tuned with the Texas chapter website. I believe this session was recorded, so that may also be made available in sometime in the future. Thank you.
Thank you all.
I bet you're welcome. Thank you.
The leader has disconnected. The conference will be terminated in 5 minutes.
Anybody still there?